Hello, everybody. I'm very happy and pleased to have the presence of Alan Wilcox here and for this channel. And Alan, I met Alan in a conference about spirituality and business, and it was really interesting conference because it brings me perspective of what companies and what leaders are trying to integrate in the normal in the current market of management and in some sense sustainable environment and functioning. So Alan works as a consultant. He brings many, I would say, many disciplines into the field, starting from his background in Baha'i faith, and also bringing ethical leadership and spiritual intelligence. He gives consultancy to Pricewaterhouse. That's the right name, right?
Yeah,
okay.
I was working with Pricewaterhouse.
Okay. And also he is a consultant for the government, and he will. I mean, for those who are interested, he will. We will talk about what is a spiritual intelligence and from different perspectives, and what are the challenges of the next future years in regards to industries, companies, groups, and in order to develop new skills that I think we as the younger generation we are called to develop. So thank you, Alan, for being here.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
I would like to start asking about what is spiritual intelligence?
Well, I think the concept of spiritual intelligence has been around for a very long time, for millennia really. I mean, in many respects, every religion in the world has a sense of spiritual intelligence, even though they might not name it as such. So it's been around for a very, very long time. There's also a number of management schools over the years which focused in on spiritual leadership. For example, in the 1960s there was a school based on Christian ethics and thought, based on servant leadership. A chap called Robert Greenleaf developed these concepts. But then in the 1990s it seemed to become popular again, and it seemed to resurge itself with Peter Senge, the Fifth Discipline, who was a Buddhist writer, and then Stephen Covey, who became very famous for particularly his book on on 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But then there were a number of other writers, and a woman around about the year 2000 called Dinah Zohar wrote a book called Spiritual Intelligence, SQ, Spiritual Intelligence. And it's quite a long book, and she defined it. And since then, the concept of spiritual intelligence per se has been talked about quite a lot by a whole range of writers. So that's perhaps how it evolved. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how? I mean, normally when I speak, it's like spirituality is separated from everything else, separated from science, separated from companies, because it's like quite oil and water, and it's that first, I think there is a belief that spirituality is the same as religion. And the second, I think, is because, personally, I think it's because a misunderstanding of what is the meaning of spirituality and how the ground of spirituality can be integrated in everything, in every discipline. What, for you, I would like to hear, for you, what's spirituality? And in your experience, because you have a lot of years in this thing, how spirituality has enhanced and improved social teams, groups, companies, industries?
Sure. Okay. There's probably a number of questions there, so let's break them down.
Yeah.
Let's break them down. Firstly, my concept of spirituality is really it's, I think, the core of religious faith and the core of any spiritual faith or spiritual belief or sense is a mystic feeling. It's a sense of inner connection. It's a sense of being at one with God or with Allah or with Yahweh or the universe, whatever we want to name this unknowable force which seems to have motivated the entire creation. So at its core, there's the sense of spiritual connection. I think usually, and certainly from a religious point of view, but also from perhaps just a more universal spiritual point of view, it's also associated often with some ethical belief, some right behaviour, right thinking in the Buddhist sense, or karma in the Hindu sense, or virtues within the Baha'i sense, or all of these kind of different acts that represent values which are spiritually based and ethically based. So there's that level. So, and then often what distinguishes perhaps a religion from more sometimes universal spirituality, but not necessarily, is it also presents a worldview. It presents a philosophy or a perspective. So when we're talking about spiritual intelligence, we often have a worldview, we have the sense of inner connection, and we also have this ethical dimension. So that's my concept, if you like, of spiritual intelligence as to how I define it. Then the next question that you asked was, how does that now influence the business world, and how is it influencing society? And I think if we look at human behaviour, and if we look at how business is based in particular, we don't have to go too far before we come up with some spiritual principles. For example, all business is based upon trustworthiness. Okay? In other words, if I pay you for a service, you deliver that service, I trust that you will deliver that service of a certain quality, of a certain standard, and on a certain time. And in addition to that, you are trusting me that I will pay you. So it's a situation where I think that trustworthiness, which is a human virtue and a spiritual virtue, is something which is critical. In addition to that, honesty, in addition to that, integrity, doing what you're saying. But it also goes beyond that too, that those firms and that those organisations and those leaders which are successful also have this kind of sense of vision which is inspiring and leads us somewhere. For example, Nelson Mandela and freedom from the oppressive apartheid regime that they had in South Africa. So this vision enables people to take things and great leaders as well. I remember a line from a film about Bill Gates where this person was wanting to leave the company, and his comment to the person was, "You can leave, that's fine. But do you want to be part of the future, or do you want to create it?" In other words, so it's something more. It's something having this vision, this sense of mission and sense of purpose. So that's one dimension of it.
Okay. And it looks like the spiritual intelligence or spirituality in companies, perhaps that's my understanding, has to do with a greater sense of community, that's it, a greater village, a village where everything is included. And I think that sometimes we only think about human beings, just integrate human beings, but I mean the world is far beyond human beings. It's like insects, animals, plants, minerals, and perhaps at the same time, because we are limited in our vision, we integrate humans, but we don't care much about the plants. We don't care much the earth, and that's why we are where we are now. So how companies, it's kind of complex for me to ask the question. The companies I know are based on profit, and it's not the moderate profit. Sometimes, a majority of times, are based in more than what is needed. When you integrate those concepts of ethics, of integration, trustworthiness, responsibility, all these qualities, does people start like waking up about what they are doing to the planet, to other sentient beings?
Yeah. I'm actually very, very positive about where we're going. And I think that there is an awakening conscious, particularly with global warming, for example. And it's unfortunately it's a consciousness that's coming now out of necessity rather than out of a driving morality, if you like. You know, in other words, that we either cook and change our entire environments and have all of these destructive weather patterns and cyclones and things like that, which can undermine our economy and ruin our crops, etc. Or alternatively, we change. And so I think there is some if you like, we've reached some limits to growth. So that's forcing a change. On the other hand, I also think that there's a positive dimension to that as well. Like, for example, a number of organisations have triple and now even quadruple bottom line reporting, so that they're evaluating not only what their finances are at the end of the year, and also what they've achieved in terms of their outputs and their business. You know, we've built several thousand houses or whatever their business is, but they're also reporting on their impact on the environment, their environmental footprint. And now many businesses are actually talking about their social footprint as well. What impact does that have on people? So you know, there's more consciousness about upline and downline costs and the impact that you have when you do something on everything else around you. For example, and now there's also, we've got to a situation in certain areas where there's this 100th monkey situation taking place, where there are some quite dramatic changes. For example, in New Zealand, as you're well aware, in the last 6 months, plastic bags have become very, very non-PC. You know, hardly anybody now is giving you products in plastic bags. They're still happening to some extent, but at the same time, supermarkets have changed, everybody's changed, because they realise that plastic in the environment and what's happening to fish eating plastics and whales eating plastics, etc., how it's ruining the ecosystem. So you've got a consciousness of people, and all of a sudden people are saying, we don't want this anymore, we want to actually change, we want to do something different. So that's why I feel positive. On one hand, we're reaching limits to growth, but on the other hand, we're also actually seeing the impact of the things we do, becoming much more conscious of it, and we're actually positioning ourselves for a much better world and a much more integrated world, if you like. Yeah.
Okay. So in a sense, companies and the industrial community are also changing. I mean, my perception, of course, is they are changing very slow. Because I see it in, for example, at uni, what they ask. I mean, it's like a linear. It's a growth based on linear relationship rather than
systemic. Yeah.
Systemic, and I think systemic thinking is not easy in some way, because sometimes can be painful at the same time. Realizing what you're doing. That's why I ask. I mean, when you see you're hurting something, you stop doing that, and maybe not stop, but doing with another awareness, and it's perhaps it's the same result, the same action, but it's with another sense of approaching things and taking care. And I don't know. I'm just.
No, I think you're right, and I think that there is far too much of that linear, short-term, profit-oriented thinking going on, or doing things the way that we've always done because we've had a certain result and it's worked in that particular social context. But with increased diversity in society, with the kind of environmental challenges that we have, sometimes that way of doing things no longer works. For example, the education system has proven in New Zealand not to work for certain ethnic groups, particularly Māori. You know, and if we offer different ways of teaching and different ways of learning, then all of a sudden we find that Māori are actually competing and even better than other ethnic groups. So there are different ways of actually achieving social outcomes. Now, I think the issue for a lot of us is around if we enlighten how we're approaching all of these things with spiritual intelligence, then we're not actually driven by either greed on one hand or profit on one hand, nor are we driven by the fact that if we don't do it, then something is going to go radically wrong, such as the environment's going to go radically wrong, or we're going to have lots of Māori who are unemployed that might join gangs and cause crime problems. We're not motivated by those kinds of things. What we're rather motivated by is what's right. You know, what's ideal for us as human beings, what's right for the planet, what's right for us as a society, and what's right for us as creatures of the universe, really. And then if we have that orientation, then we're looking at our business from a sustainable point of view, and we're saying, okay, what's long term, how do we adjust? And we don't expect to be doing the same thing in 2 years' time that we're doing now. We don't see it in terms of linear relationships, and we see things in terms of evolution, in terms of profit. Yes, but profit that's evolving and growing, and it may be based on something completely different in 5 years' time than it is now, because it's evolved with the times and with the needs and with customer perception and with demand. So it's a dynamic process of learning and growing, as opposed to a process which is stilted and, as you say, linear and often short term.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that from the Buddhist perspective is that it's when you see the painful dimension of life with the happiness or joyful aspect of life, it's when you can see both that real transformation occurs. And I think that that's what happening to me in some sense. It's like some people say maybe you're like too extreme, not money, but it's not that. It's like I really understand that the operational system of society is through economics and through growth based on money, but it's what we were talking before is about what we do with our profits and how we engage with money. It's like thinking in a wider perspective and see at the same time that what we have is the product of many things. And when you see, like, for example, this iPad is the result of many things, we have a better sense of appreciation, and then we take care, and it's a less utilitarian attitude. And I take care if it's an iPad, a cup of tea, or an animal, or a plant, and then it's like we become the caretakers of everything. And I like that aspect of Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy. That is quite disappointing. What's the word? Quite sad, but at the same time it brings like joy because you appreciate things. So.
No, I think it's beautiful, and I think it's very similar to a number of other philosophical traditions. For example, this concept which Māori have of what they call kaitiakitanga, in other words, guardianship. That you're really only here for a period of time, and your role is to look after things for the future generation. And it's very similar to the Bible, for example, where it talks about how God gave man, human beings, dominion over all that was on the earth, the creatures on earth. In other words, he set them up in such a way that he can either bring joy and love to nature or whatever, or he can destroy it, and we've got to those boundaries now. So I think you're right. There is a huge responsibility that comes with that, and that responsibility can be a burden, and it can be quite painful. But on the other side, it can also be when you start seeing things work and when you start seeing things happen, that's when joy comes together, and you think, yes.
And in the past, it's like the human capabilities have also evolved in different wheels, different layers. In the past, it was very valued, like in the intellect and the capability to resolve problems, and then it was integrated emotions. And now, I just hear about spiritual intelligence. So how spiritual intelligence is part of the bigger intelligence? Can you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I'll give you my understanding. I think that we have different capabilities, and I think in earlier society, still today to some extent, but certainly a lot less, physical capability or physical intelligence was predominant. If you were bigger and stronger and fitter, then you were able to do more. And I often think that that's one of the reasons why historically there's been inequality between the genders, that men have been more powerful physically, and so, if people don't agree with you, what do? You beat them up.
Yeah.
and then they agree with you pretty quickly. So if you like, physical capability was strong. Now, it's still very important, physical capability and physical intelligence. And then I think, for a long period of time, IQ, when I was young, it was all about IQ tests, intelligent capability, intellectual quotient, and what have you. No one really earlier on defined what IQ tests were and what IQ was. And I remember studying education many years ago at university, and they said IQ tests measure what IQ tests measure. So it's kind of like art is what art is, So. Yeah. And now they've factored in and broken it down into divergent construction and, integrative and disintegrative and all sorts of other things. So that IQ became quite powerful. And then, of course, in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a lot of work through people like Daniel Goleman and others who talked a lot about emotional intelligence, and they talked about things such as emotional agility, the ability to move between one emotional state and the other and to be aligned with that, the ability to be present and aware in different circumstances, and they began to factor that and developed a lot about emotional intelligence. And then, as I mentioned earlier on, this concept of spiritual intelligence began to come about, or spiritual quotient began to come about, that yes, it's not just about emotional intelligence. For example, I can be very emotionally aware and aligned with something but be completely wrong. For example, I can be totally at one with somebody who's just stealing a house, just stealing something from a house, and I empathise and I'm at one with that. But there's a broader sense of morality, there's a broader sense of spirituality that fits with. So emotional intelligence, while it's integrated with spiritual intelligence, in actual fact, none of these can be separated completely from each other. But at the same time, we factor them because it's a way in which we can understand them.
It's like in this diagram. Perhaps the goal is to be able to at least kind of not develop completely, but look what it's about, what are your where are you in each dimension. And because of the times we are facing now, all these values that probably are based in a spiritual domain are left behind. Now it's time to recover them and redefine them. And do you think that this, what do you see in companies? Where in which quadrant does the teams are like more located there?
Where the needs, where they're located, yeah. Well, one of the things which I often do with my clients when I'm brought in to address something, and they don't sort of usually hire me because I'm some kind of a weird religious nutter or a spiritual guru or anything like that. They hire me because I'm a management consultant that has actually worked in the government sector and worked in business and made money and done all sorts of other things, which is what they're wanting to do, and overcome problems. So they don't hire me for that. So I go in, but what I often do is I'll group of people and I'll say, okay, and I'll put up a whiteboard and I'll say to them, okay, just tell me what the problems and the issues are. And I will put them into these 4 categories without them knowing what those categories are. And for example, they will say, okay, what are the problems that you're experiencing at work today? And it's often things like absenteeism, and or bullying in the workplace, or low morale, or a whole range of these sorts of challenges which they come about. And lack of effort or lack of enthusiasm, not clear directions, all of these kinds of things. These are typical workplace challenges. And I'll put them all on the whiteboard, and then I'll draw this quadrant. And most of them usually end up in the spiritual area. Some in the emotional area, but a lot of them in the spiritual area.
Wow.
These are challenges which we are dealing with in our workplace right now. And they're not issues which you can actually necessarily, you can train people to some extent, but they're not issues where you go and read a book about and then you come back. It's about developing capability to be able to be sensitive to each other, to be able to understand the values framework that we're working with, and to actually be caring, to actually do a whole range of other things. And all of a sudden these issues of absenteeism and what had to create a vision, and all of a sudden to say, where are we going here? What is it? And what's the purpose of what we're doing? And how is it benefiting other people? All of a sudden, the black and white TV all of a sudden becomes colour, you know? And then the whole thing changes, you know? And then and people say, oh, okay, we need to do this. So I think that's a big challenge in the workplace. So it's and then another thing I do with leaders is I go through a 360 analysis, and I ask them all of these questions that are factored in both to physical and to intellectual and to emotional and also to spiritual capability. And often leaders have to develop things of trustworthiness, doing what they're saying, you know, or saying what they, you know, and then following through on action, and actually being aware and looking after their staff and valuing their staff and rewarding effectively. These are all things which are motivated by an underpinning desire to do so, rather than saying, okay, we don't want to pay them too much because that's going to erode our profits. Why don't we overpay them and make them happy, and therefore they will deliver more? Yes, hold them to accountable, but at the same time, as one of the managers here in Auckland said one time, very well-known manager said one time, he says, I like my general managers to be both overpaid and overworked. In other words, I want high expectations, I want a lot from them, and I'm going to reward them handsomely. You know? And he created that vision, and he's been very, very successful in just about every area where he's gone. And he's exercising, independent of whether he might say it or not, this sense of spiritual intelligence which is required.
I would like to go through this presentation, Alan, about what does perhaps this concept that we already talked, spiritual intelligence underpins IQ and EQ, and it's an ability to access higher meanings, values, like non-tangible domains, right? And here, this is very, very interesting for me. And could you have a little explanation about it?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think when we when we look at the domains of human capability, one of the things which I often come across is people we don't talk about managers anymore. These days we talk about leaders, you know. And I'm saying, well, do we? And to be blunt, I don't actually believe about that. I actually think that management and leadership can be separated, but they're also integrated. And that a lot of people who are leaders aren't necessarily managers, and a lot of people who are managers certainly aren't leaders. Problem solving, they've got to be creative, they've got to have some planning skills. If they can't plan, they can't manage. And they've also got to have some capacity to evaluate, because if they can't measure what they're actually doing, then how can they manage it as well? So those are at the intellectual level, but at an emotional level, they also have to have emotional control. They can't throw the toys out of the cot every now and then, and they can't, you know, swear at their staff and, you know, do all sorts of things, which unfortunately I find happening. They've also got to have some level of communication capacity, and then also develop listening skills, the ability to listen and to hear, and some sort of capacity to delegate, to motivate people, and to recognise and to reward them, and to facilitate them to do the sorts of things they want to do. So that's at an emotional level. And then at a spiritual level, they need some basic trustworthiness and integrity and honesty and a sense of purpose, because if they can't give that to their staff and they can't give that to the people they're working with, then people often say, well, you know, what's it all about? So that's at a, if you like, an inner core of management characteristics. At a level of inspirational leadership qualities, I think, however, it takes on another dimension again. And if we look at those same quadrants of human capability, if you look at leaders over the centuries that we admire, whether it's Mahatma Gandhi or Nelson Mandela, the high level of perseverance. You know, they've endured pain. They've gone through challenges, and they've kept to their goals. But they've also had those superordinate goals. You know, those goals that that are inspirational, that are going to actually change things. Whether it's Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi or any of the wonderful leaders that we've got in world history. And so they've got these superordinate goals and this capacity. So at a physical level, they're at a certain level. Also at an intellectual level, they've got the ability to articulate and the ability to convey. So they're often very persuasive in terms of their language and the words which they're using. And they're also usually capable of using the resources and talents around them. And I think this is a distinguishing feature of a leader as opposed to a manager. That is that they can identify skills and know where people can work. And in fact, some of the organisations I've worked in and for, they're almost self-designing. And they're designed around the task and around the person who can actually contribute the best to that task. And everybody else stands back and says, yes, this is what we do, and shift about, and job descriptions become almost meaningless because it's really task-oriented and program-oriented and built around skills and capacity. Then at an emotional level, I think good leaders have a strong degree of passion, and they've got a phenomenal amount of emotional agility. I remember once watching the English Prime Minister, Tony Blair, on television, and it was a situation where there'd been some quite significant disaster in the Middle East. And his comments were, today we are all Iraqi. In other words, he was, this is, we're totally at one with that, and it was totally aligned. And it was a very great sort of moment. They've often got great courtesy and charm. Look at people like Bill Clinton, for example, who had this enormous capacity to win over hearts, independent of what he might have won them for. And they've got powerful negotiation skills and often highly intuitive. I mean, we don't value intuition very much in the workplace, but in actual fact, often intuition is something that leads us in a particular direction and can be even more right than our analytical capability. And strong leaders have these intuitive capability. But then at the spiritual level, what we're actually seeing from spiritual leaders is this superordinate goals, this amazing vision, if you like, outstanding vision. But they often have very strong commitment. They've often got outstanding courage, wisdom, sacrifice, and they're often strong, loving qualities, that people actually don't feel judged or feel put down by them, but they feel loved and valued by them. And that's another situation that, as a human being, you're important, and you're important to me, and I care about you for you, and I want you to do. And then as a result of saying, I want you to do, and whether, of course, and then they sacrifice for these people because of this capacity. So I think spiritual intelligence has a very, very strong part to play in what we have traditionally seen as inspirational leaderships.
And this is just the last part of our talk, and I'm just interested in why inspirational leaders are not necessarily in these kind of enterprises and these kind of companies, because you said not all inspirational leaders are in this kind of management structure, or this management structure does not include necessarily this kind of leaders. Am I wrong, or did I understand well, or how it comes?
No, I think. Often people that get into management and leadership positions get there because of their professional or technical expertise. Okay, that usually and it starts something like this, that you might have somebody who's an engineer and is a fantastic engineer and very bright and intelligent engineer. So because he or she is the leader from an intellectual point of view, we say, okay, let's make them the manager, all right? Mm-hmm. And then, because they can correct everybody else's mistakes and what have you. But what we don't realise is that the role of a manager and a leader is to release the capacity of those around them, not to actually necessarily do it themselves. So often you have this person who may be, just for an engineer, we're using this as an example, or it might be a doctor, a nurse, or it might be anything, a teacher, social worker. Often what happens is we get the best social workers or the best teachers or the best engineers, we put them in leadership positions, and there's a whole different skill set that needs to be brought to bear, and they don't have these. But then they often progress through that, and often they're working 70, 80 hours a week correcting everybody else's mistakes, and often because they have enormous capacity, they're able to do that, but it's often one person, then everybody else is actually following this person, so it's a kind of a mother duck type syndrome. Then what often happens is that you get people into positions where people may be appointed because they control certain areas. For example, often finance managers will become chief executives because they've understood how the finances work and they can control the finances and all of this kind of thing. And so often it's a situation where people aren't valuing certain key qualities or leadership skills and qualities. And often I've seen situations where an organisation may have had leaders with certain, or chief executives with certain orientations, and those might have been very good on finance but very poor on relationships. So they say, okay, we don't want another finance manager as our chief executive. What we want is a relationship manager. So they go out and they select somebody who's got strong on relationship skills because that's the issue which is confronting them at a particular time. And then all of a sudden the finances blow out over the next 2 or 3 years because there's no one with their hand on the tiller that's actually controlling all of these sorts of things. And I've seen organisations make this mistake time and time again, rather than actually saying, hey, there are some balanced leadership qualities which we need to run this organisation, and we need to actually think beyond what our current problems are and need to think into the future for the next 5 or 6 or 8 years to enable them to make a contribution.
That's wonderful. I have now a better understanding on where we are going as future people to be employed in industries like me. And that it looks like the core is to be a more integral person that integrates not only like personal domains but interpersonal skills, professional skills. So it's like a whole development of all aspects in one person with its potential, and it's like in some sense the leaders, the managers, they are like the gardeners of the soil, and they just put like the nutrients and then just wait until it blossoms. But that's in one sense. In the other, in one dimension, in the other dimension, perhaps we are the only ones who are called to be our own gardeners and to put the seed and be patient with the time, with the season, and it's like a more have this feeling that is more not demanding but not soft, but it's in the middle of contemplating nature and contemplating growth in a more natural vision. So I really appreciate Alan, really appreciate your wisdom and all that you bring here and your time. Thank you for being here, and I hope this video is useful for everybody.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Well, see you soon. Bye.